In the name and presence of our living God, we come. Please be seated. The readings for today remind me of one of my favorite praise songs. Its lyrics center me on who we are and whose we are. As individuals, as community, this day and always. The words are written in your bulletin if you want to follow along. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. I can feel God's mighty power and God's grace. I can hear the brush of angels' wings. I see glory on each face. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. Moses came down from the mountain. The skin of his face shone because he had been talking with God. Aaron and the other Israelites saw Moses, the skin of his face shining, and they were afraid to come near him. It happened after Moses had been talking with God. When Moses receives the law on Mount Sinai, God's glory appears in a cloud. Clouds were considered by the people of ancient Israel to be an awesome manifestation of divine power. The Old Testament stories tell us that by day, a cloud pillar guided the wilderness march of Israel. And the cloud manifested God's glory, the presence of God by day. And at night, God's glory was revealed in a pillar of fire. So God spoke to Moses out of a cloud, and then Moses spoke to the people. He passed on the information that God gave him. So Moses really acted as a buffer, if you will, a buffer between the glory of God and the people themselves. God spoke to Moses out of a cloud. Now, the story that we heard this morning from Luke, the story of the Transfiguration, is missing that buffer. Did you notice? The buffer between the glory of God and the people. The gap, the separation between the people and God is gone. And that's because Jesus bridges that gap for Peter and John and James. And us, happily. Walking with Jesus, we are right there. Living in the promise, the reality of God's presence in our life. It's a similar story, though, to the Old Testament lesson, isn't it? While Jesus was praying on the mountain, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Peter and John and James saw his glory, and those men who had been so sleepy, tired out from the walk, were now wide awake. Wide awake. A cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as that cloud came over them, and they entered it, and they heard a voice. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. And they kept silent. I think I would have to. It all happened when they went up on the mountain to pray. I want to suggest to you that we are standing at the foot of the mountain today, right now. In our opening collect this morning, we prayed that we might behold by faith the light of Jesus' countenance and be changed into his likeness from glory to glory. Do we dare to look upon the glory of God? Do we dare pray that we be changed into his likeness from glory to glory? 6 weeks ago, on the first Sunday after the Epiphany, the assigned gospel reading, you might remember, the assigned gospel reading was Luke's account of Jesus' baptism. Now, even imagining Jesus' baptism is for me an experience of awe and worship and wonder. The heavens splitting, the dove descending, and Luke's description of what happened when all the people were baptized and when Jesus had also been baptized and was praying, a voice came from heaven. You are my Son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. A voice came from heaven while Jesus was praying. And for Jesus, his baptism and that voice of God marked the beginning of his journey to Jerusalem, to the cross. Most of us here today have been baptized, but I doubt if too many, if any of us, had anywhere near this extraordinary awareness of God's presence, of hearing God's voice at our baptism. Yet for us, as it was for Jesus, our baptism is the beginning of a journey. Some of you know that before I entered seminary, Dick and I owned retail businesses in Grand Lake, Colorado. We were raising 3 children, and I was blessed to be a teacher at the local elementary school as well. It was really making ends meet living in a summer resort. But this was a long time ago, and I have a story to tell you about that. It was a long time before we had computers, personal computers, or cell phones available to each student. Back then, when I taught 3rd and 4th graders, one of the teaching tools that I used was the World Almanac. Remember those? Anybody remember World Almanacs? They were, this thick. The kids loved it. They absolutely loved it. Each child had a copy there in the classroom available to him or her. And what a wealth of information it had inside. Believe it or not, I found the kids reading the almanac during their free reading times. And they often took a copy home to show their parents and share with them. For my students, this almanac was a great resource for learning to use an index, working with a variety of charts, and for learning to read big numbers. That was one of the projects in math in 4th grade, big numbers. So we spent hours looking up cities and states, reading and comparing their populations. And we had contests to see who could find and read correctly the air distances between cities, major cities in the world. You name the subject, there are charts and lists in the World Almanac. The top-rated TV shows are there, sports standings, assets of the world's biggest and greatest banks. The favorite section, though, of the almanac, every year, every class I had was the section on disasters. Shipwrecks, aircraft crashes, hurricanes, earthquakes. The kids were absolutely fascinated by these topics. So early on, I had to wonder about the wisdom of poring over such grim statistics, deaths, human suffering. But every year, I noticed that we always ended up talking about those terrible accidents, disasters, what they meant to the people who lived in those times and in those places. What they meant to those who knew and loved the people who perished in the crashes or the floods. How did the people left behind live through and cope with such losses? This week we might ask, How do people live through warfare and the invasion of their country? Or here at home, what can be done to end racial violence, street shootings? What did such disasters teach 9 and 10-year-olds sitting in an elementary school classroom in the Rocky Mountain Resort community? Well, somehow the conversation always got around to the subject of families, relationships, support, love, and the importance and the responsibility we have for each other. Once in a while, a youngster would bring up the idea that it was awful that God would make such a thing happen. Ooh. And even in a public school, I responded to such a statement. We talked about how God, however we see or describe God, how God is in the midst of those families, those relationships. That's what I believe. God is there in the midst, supporting, loving, and caring. I told my students, a bit boldly I might add, what I believe. And God doesn't make disasters happen. But God is there with us when they do occur, in helping to get us through all those difficult times. Now, of course, not all of those children came from homes that were grounded in faith. But most did, and it was very surprising. I had 2 brothers from a Sikh family who had moved from India to Grand Lake, Colorado. It was a great thing. The teachers, students became very aware that each one of us was on a journey, however we described that journey. It was a life journey together. What amazing conversations those were. I don't know if we could do them today. But we talked about the importance of relationships and support and encouragement in times of sorrow and in times of great joy. Mountaintop conversations they were. This morning, we read that following their experiences on the mountain, Peter, James, and John, and Jesus too, became very aware that they too were on a journey. And Jesus moves from the mountain towards his time of suffering. His disciples, ready or not, move right with him to face the same, don't they? In the coming Lenten season, we will join and travel with Jesus and his disciples on the way to Jerusalem. And perhaps, like them, we're going to start out a little sleepy. Peter and James and John saw his glory. What about us? What about us? A cloud came in, overshadowed them. They were terrified as they entered the cloud. How about us? Peter and James and John heard God's voice, and they were alone with Jesus. Peter, who had been so chatty a few moments before, was now speechless. They kept silent. Are we as awed by the possibility, the reality of God's presence? We too are called to listen for God's voice in prayer, in silence, alone with Jesus. God's glory can overshadow us too. And that's good news. Jesus went up on the mountain to pray. The transfiguration occurred as he was praying. And at his baptism, Jesus was praying. His continuing prayer life sustained him and his ministry. Isn't that true for us today? Through our continuing prayer life, we find meaning and direction. Our ministries are sustained by the voice and the presence of God. We are not promised a journey free of suffering. More likely, we're promised immersion in the suffering of the world. Perhaps that's why the disciples were so quiet after listening to God. For it is a sobering thought. Peter and James and John learned some things, but they really didn't understand them. They learned that Jesus, the one they were following, the one they loved, must suffer and die and be raised. And they learned he is indeed God's Son, who must be obeyed. I wonder, did they talk about the importance of relationship, support, and encouragement in times of sorrow, in times of joy, wherever that road was leading? God's glory surrounds us here at St. Luke's. Through the sacrament of the Eucharist, we receive Holy Communion, and God's glory actually fills us. Whatever life brings, we make the journey in the confidence of knowing and experiencing God's presence firsthand. God's presence in our lives is about relationships and support and love. And God's promise, God's presence, is all about prayer, about listening, about traveling together. We are changed into his likeness. It's already beginning. Look around you. Look at the person next to you. See Christ's glory in each other. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place. I can feel God's mighty power and God's grace. I can hear the brush of angels' wings. I see glory on each face. Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place.